Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today our episode is an encore presentation of Michael Pollan's keynote presentation at the 2019 Psychedelic Integration Conference at the Esalen Institute. Seems like everybody should know who Michael Pollan is by now, but if you've been living under a rock where no psychedelic sun can get in, Michael Pollan is the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, including 2018's How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. It's a great book, I'd say, written by the preeminent immersive journalist of our time. And of course, it's recently become a 4-part Netflix show, also entitled How to Change Your Mind, which garnered a 75% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes when I looked it up this morning, which I think is fair. You know, I watched the show, I liked it. I wasn't totally blown away. I don't know why. It was good. I learned stuff. But you know, one of the things I find notable about Michael Pollan, one of the things I truly love is that he sort of lends credibility to every subject he tackles. When Michael Pollan talks, people listen. And I think that's because he's not just an incredible writer or great speaker, but also because he makes sure to bring a healthy dose of skepticism to the table. You know, the field of psychedelics can get pretty grandiose pretty fast, and I'm guilty of this as well. There are promises made, you know, that psychedelics will save the environment, that they'll stop fascism. If only enough people would take them, they would imbue our society with a sense of wonder and oneness, and soon everybody would be coming to Esalen. Well, you'll hear in this presentation that despite having authored one of the most culturally important books on psychedelics in the past decade, Michael Pollan is not really a psychedelic cheerleader. You know, he's suspicious of the most grandiose claims of the movement. And it's that skepticism, I think, that makes his own interest and hopes in this realm of plant medicine that much more powerful, that much more believable. Quick Michael Pollan story for you from that 2019 Psychedelic Integration Conference. I really wanted to get a second alone with Michael, mostly because I was actually running the Esalen Instagram at that time. And I just had this vision for a great post. I wanted to take a photo of him and just quickly interview him about the first time he was at Esalen a decade before, why he came. It was going to be just a 5-minute ask, and I knew it would make for a really popular post. And that was my job at the time. But here's the problem. He was pretty hard to corner. He was definitely the most famous person at the conference, Paul Stamets being the second most, the Mushroom Man. And every time that Michael was alone, even for a second, someone would slide up into his personal space. He was very friendly, super approachable, I could tell. And even though I wasn't afraid of him, like I am of nearly all famous people, I still had to compete with all these other suitors for his attention. And I'm very polite. I'm not going to go up and ask him to do something if he's already engaged with somebody else. I'm a polite person. So that whole week dragged on, and this desire of mine was just weighing on me and weighing on me. And then I heard that Michael was actually going to leave a day early on Thursday. And I was agonizing over it. How do I get this dude? And then I heard him say to somebody that he was going to go down to the baths before he left. And I actually saw him start walking down the hill. And I swear to you, at that moment, I set my watch. I waited exactly half an hour, and I left the conference. I kept my tape recorder rolling, but I left the room. And I walked halfway down the hill towards the baths, and I just posted up and waited. And 5 minutes later, he walked right into my trap. Totally relaxed, fresh from the baths, open to an interview. And that's how it's done, folks. And he was totally cool. He treated me like a real reporter, actually, or something like that. He gave me the time of day, talked to me, let me take a picture. At first, he thought I wanted a picture with him. I was like, no, I don't want a weird selfie like that. I just want to take a picture of you. And at the end of our talk, he said, good luck with your work. And something about the way he said that just made me feel like, yeah, okay. I am doing work here. I'm going to make you proud, Michael. He was just like my skeptical, psychedelic uncle. And he can be yours too. Let's do this. Let's get into this archival talk. And one note before I begin, a question and answer session followed Michael's speech. And to preserve the confidentiality of the participants, I've eliminated the questions and only presented the answers. I've also edited this speech for clarity and for pacing. The introduction is by Alan Badiner, who co-convened the conference, along with Dream Mulick. So with no further ado, here's that psychonaut you can bring home for dinner. My man, Michael Pollan.
At Bioneers, I asked Michael Pollan if it was a surprise to him that he has become the global Pied Piper of psychedelics and its best known and trusted advocate. He laughed and said, absolutely. About 4 years ago, when I read his piece in the New Yorker, Trip Treatment, I knew that the psychedelic renaissance was truly underway. The thing I love about Michael is how he shares his thought process with you, not just the conclusions, but the accumulated evidence in all directions. Michael and I are solidly in agreement about the possibility that psychedelics need to become an ecological imperative. We have precious little time to forge a more realistic and powerful relationship with all forms of life and to do what we can to stop the destruction of our ecosystem. Michael, I am so grateful, as I know everybody is, that you were able to join us. Thank you.
It's a real privilege to be here for me, in part because I feel more like you guys than these guys. These are my teachers. Almost everyone on this panel, no, I would say everyone on this panel, either through interviews I did with them or reading their books, really shaped what I know. But hopefully now, I mean, what happens when you're a journalist is you interview a bunch of people and then you're regarded as an expert. So it's kind of a racket. But I'll do my best to channel what they have to say. I'm looking forward to talking to you about a question that's come up a lot in my research, and this was the fact that so many of the scientists I interviewed, if you got them out for a drink or got them talking long enough, would eventually, and these are some very straight, sober scientists, would eventually share with you their hopes, as Stan Grof said in that quote, that these substances have the potential to change not just individuals, but society, and help us correct our relationship to the natural world and to one another. It's a pretty audacious claim for a medicine. So I want to have a conversation with you about that and talk to you about, is that really realistic? How do you go about it? And introduce a note of skepticism about it too, because I do have some skepticism about it. And share with you a little bit about my process writing about psychedelic experience, which, as you know, is not easy to do. Many of you have tried. And I'm going to give you a little disclaimer in advance. I'm hoping to frame some questions for you. I don't have the answers on how psychedelics are going to change society. Sorry. And if you want to go to the baths now, this is a good time to go. But I hope what I can do, as someone who's kind of newer to this community than almost all of you, and has a certain distance on it and historical perspective, perhaps, from my research, help you frame the questions and figure out some of the key decisions you have to make in strategically and tactically in bringing psychedelics and what they offer, their gift to the larger society, okay? So I want to start by telling you a little bit about how I came to this subject, because I'm not of psychedelics born. As you know, I've been writing about other topics for a long time. My subject as a writer, as I see it, I mean, many people think of me as the food guy, but I always thought of myself as the nature guy, because my passion as a writer has always been the human engagement with the natural world. All my writing begins in the garden and my obsession with plants and growing them. And understanding the really interesting reciprocal relationship of humans and other species, particularly plant species, how they change us and how we change them. And seeing ourselves in this very much part of nature, not standing outside nature. You know, we're the only species that speaks of having a relationship to nature. I mean, what are the assumptions in that word? I mean, it's bizarre. But we have this odd status in nature that we're in it and we somehow stand outside it. So that's my subject. Of course, if you care about the relationship of plants and of nature and humans, you're going to look at food because that's our most profound engagement with the natural world. We change nature more through our eating than anything else we do. If you think about what's happened to the landscape through agriculture and deforestation, if you think about what's happening to the composition of species on the earth, that is the result of what we like to eat and what threatens what we like to eat. And if you think of even the atmosphere, it has been affected more by agriculture than, in that case, anything with the exception of the burning of fossil fuels. So how does psychedelics fit into this? Well, I've been interested in all the different things plants do for humans. They feed us, they give us beauty, and the weirdest thing they do for us, I think, is give us these modes of ways to change consciousness. And that these are all fundamental human desires. And that the desire to change consciousness is found in every culture on Earth, uses a plant or a fungus to change consciousness, with one exception, and that's the Inuit, because nothing good grows where they live. The only reason. As soon as they move to Canada, they get with the program, and they find their plant drugs or alcohol or whatever it is. So that's been in the back of my mind since I wrote a book called The Botany of Desire, which has a chapter on cannabis. And I got very interested in this aspect of what good is it to change consciousness, right? I mean, it would seem to be maladaptive. Yes, relief of pain is important. That's a very good use of plants. But a lot of the more radical ways plants change us and change the experience of consciousness leaves us at kind of disadvantage, right? I mean, you're more likely to be predated. You're vulnerable when you're high, when you're tripping. Yet we seem to seek out this experience. So that is a paradox that I've always been engaged by. And what good are psychedelics? It should be fit into that question. How are they adaptive? Are any plant medicines adaptive? So anyway, I started exploring these issues in Botany and Desire. And then more recently, I started learning about something you all know about, which is this renaissance of research. For me, it was learning about the cancer studies going on at NYU and Hopkins. And I found out about that, as many people did, through a little article in the science section of the New York Times about the NYU trials. And I was very perplexed and engaged by that. And it seemed like the last thing I would want to do if I got a terminal diagnosis was take a psychedelic, give up control over my mind at a moment of this maximum vulnerability. But it was helping people. And I need to give you a little background autobiographically. It came at a particular moment, which is my dad had just gotten a terminal diagnosis for lung cancer. And he was already 87, 88, and he didn't speak about it. He just really wouldn't talk about it. Clearly, he was depressed. He just processed it very internally. And as many times as I tried to engage him in a conversation about what he was going through and what it meant for him, I couldn't. And then here were these people in this trial who I began interviewing for an article. And I was able to have this incredibly candid, open, blunt discussion about death, about mortality, about how they thought about what was coming. So that was, I never mentioned this in the book, but that was a big part of the background of what got me into it. It was a conversation I needed to have. And as it turned out, these volunteers, some of whom are still alive and many of whom are not, shared this with me. I came to psychedelics as a skeptic and continue to have some skepticism, although I've been convinced of many interesting, unexpected things. I'm an outsider to this community still, I feel, which is where you want to be as a journalist. You need to remain a little bit outside. And then I also decided, though, when I went from writing this article for The New Yorker to doing a book, that I couldn't do justice to the topic without having a series of psychedelic experiences of my own. And for me, that was a very momentous decision. I did not do psychedelics at the age-appropriate stage of life. Nothing in college, a little bit of mushrooms, but aesthetic experiences in my 20s. But I realized this is what I needed to do. And as you know, if you've read the book, I had a series of guided experiences. I was a very reluctant psychonaut. I was really terrified before almost every experience I had. But they, for the most part, with one notable exception, were wonderful experiences that taught me really important things I didn't know and raised the kind of questions for me that brings me here today to talk about this issue. One of the things that really struck me in my research, and I was interviewing some of the most sober scientists you can imagine, who were working on psychedelics. I'm thinking of people like Roland Griffith or Steve Ross at NYU or Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College, was that in addition to talking to me about the nuts and bolts of their research, they would share this dream that they had. And they would tell me, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes less so, that these molecules have the potential to change the world. This was kind of stunning to me, that this grandiosity, which is what it sounded like to me, to solve the environmental crisis, to end war, bring peace. And this is not what you expect to hear from scientists, who are always very careful about their claims. And this made a big impression on me. And just to give you an example, I came across this quote from a scientist working on psychedelics. I don't even know who it is, because he gave this quote to a reporter and didn't want to be quoted. And that's a point we need to talk about, is the taboo of this idea. A lot of us don't say it out loud, but it's impossible not to be inspired by psychedelics' radical social potential when you see their impacts on people and how they view the world. We don't want to anger the department heads or touch a cultural third rail by talking about it. Politicizing the research, and it's interesting, she goes from that idea to this amounts to politicizing the research, and I guess that's true, would risk the incredible progress we're making. That's the fear. So I think in that ambiguity of that anonymous quote, you get a sense of where many of the researchers are on this. And, people like Daniel Pinchbeck have spoken very openly of achieving what he called a self-willed rapid mutation in human consciousness via psychedelics. Now, after having a series of experiences, some of them quite big, I get it. I totally get it. You do feel that this is a medicine for our moment, our specific moment. We were talking the other day about why now, and I think the why now has to do with the nature of the medicine as well as the general rhythms of history. Here you have something that, in many people who take it, especially those who have the vaunted experience of ego dissolution, and I'd like to brag about mine for a minute, that this seems to answer to at least two of the biggest crises we face. One, of course, is the environmental crisis, and the other is the crisis of tribalist politics, right? They're actually the same problem, I think, and I think that's one of the insights of psychedelics, that they are the same problem. And let me explain how that is. I think that, and this is based on my own experience, I think that one of the things that happens when you do have this either dissolution or even just shrinking of ego is that connections are established, that what the ego does is build walls. And what the ego does is enforce a subject-object understanding of our relationship to other things in the world, and therefore the objectifying of what we're perceiving as subjects. So much of our nature problem is the fact that we do see ourselves as outside, standing outside nature, looking at it as the only subject in the natural world. Everything else in nature is an object. As soon as you call something an object, it loses its, you're then entitled to do with it what you can, right? You can act on it, because it doesn't have subjectivity, it doesn't have agency, it doesn't have its own point of view. What happened to me on my first high dose psilocybin trip was a powerful experience of, I was in my garden in New England, and a powerful experience of the subjectivity of all the plants in my garden. They were returning my gaze. They were looking back at me. They were incredibly benign. They liked me. I'd planted them. I took care of them. And it was a completely uncomplicated, wonderful experience. But it was an idea that I'd had that become flesh, the idea that plants have a point of view. I mean, Botany of Desire, the subtitle was A Plant's Eye View of the World. And suddenly I could see the plant's eye view of the world. And it was the most wonderful thing. And I generally had a sense, and I think many people I've talked to have this sense of that subjectivity, or if you want to call it consciousness, is spread much more equally over the world than we think in our ordinary hours. I don't know how veridical that is. You know, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's a wish fulfillment of an idea I had. It was a concept that became flesh, but there it is. But tribalism is a result of course, erecting the same kind of walls, the same kind of objectifying of the other. The other, in that case, instead of being plants or animals, are other people. And that we see them as objects, and we are the only subject, the only one that matters, or perhaps us and our friends and family. So this challenge to the rule of the ego that seems to come out of the psychedelic experience has enormous political implications for how you see your place in the world and how you conceive of others of all kinds. That's a really big deal. The other really interesting question it brings up is questions about the usual materialist understanding of consciousness, right? I mean, there is a sense that many people acquire that there is some sort of consciousness that exists outside our brains. No idea if there's any truth to that. But when I had my experience of ego dissolution, I had the experience of ego dissolution. So who was that I that had that experience? What was that new perspective that opened up that was so untroubled by the collapse of this thing that I thought was identical to me? And I don't know the answer. Some people acquire that perspective, which is just so kind of untroubled, objective, calm, and say, well, that's the mind at large. That's what Huxley thought it was. That's some kind of transpersonal consciousness. Or maybe it's another character in your own mind. Anyway, the key point is questions are raised about things we take for granted. So all this has implications beyond the individual without question. And some of this has been, I think Ben mentioned the other day, has been looked at by some of the scientists. And Rick mentioned it too, that Imperial College has looked at this question of authoritarian tendencies and nature relatedness on surveys of people, and before and after there is a change in those two metrics, which is really interesting. I think we should do that research. I think we should do more of that research, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. But anyway, it's really interesting, and especially living in this moment where objectifying the other has become essentially the official policy of the United States government, and when the environment is in free fall, this seems relevant. It seems useful. It's no accident that this meme is out there that if only we could get Trump to trip. And, you know, it's worth thinking about that. I mean, it is exactly the right prescription for that person, right? I mean, and yet, of course, it would never happen because objectifying the other, building walls, is his superpower. And he knows this very well. And why would he possibly jeopardize his superpower? So then you have to start thinking about, well, could we dose him without him knowing it? You know, put some LSD in a well-cooked steak or McDonald's. But I'm joking. But the existence of that fantasy should tell us something about him, but also about us, right? And that the wish fulfillment that a chemical could solve our problems. So keep that in mind. And it raises this other issue: is okay, if you have a molecule, a plant medicine or a medicine that has the potential, if enough people take it, to change consciousness on a beyond universal level, how do you do that? How do you prescribe a drug to a culture? We mentioned fluoride the other day. That's like the one example we have. Vaccinations, okay? But those are not very good models for what we're talking about. Now, this is an old story, and I think here history can illuminate things a little bit. This was very much the conversation beginning in the 1950s when Huxley was introduced to mescaline. Humphrey Osmond, a psychiatrist who did very important work in Saskatchewan, Abram Hoffer, his colleagues, but also Timothy Leary, Allen Ginsberg, Ken Kesey, they all shared this belief that this molecule had the power to change not just their consciousness, but human consciousness. So this is not a new idea. It drove Leary, really, especially as time went on, and he lost interest in science. But they had a debate then about that question. How do you prescribe a drug to a culture? And there was a real split, and that split still exists, and that split is worth exploring, between what I would call, and I don't mean the pejorative to apply to this word, the elitist approach and the populist approach. The elitist approach was best summarized and kind of first articulated by this really interesting character from the history of psychedelics, Al Hubbard, who I mentioned last night. And I don't want to go into great detail about him. He's much less known than Leary. He's perhaps just as influential as Leary in his own way. He was a Catholic mystic, an inventor, a rum runner, an FBI agent. He was everything. Had many, many contradictions, a real man of mystery. He had his own, after becoming a very successful businessman, he had an experience in 1951, an angelic visitation while hiking in Washington State, that he could be involved. An angel came down and told him he could be involved in something that would change the course of human civilization, or he could not be involved. The angel didn't say what it was, but a year later, this is 1951, he reads one of the first pieces of research about LSD. It was a rat experiment. And I don't remember what LSD had done to the rats. I didn't think it did anything to rats, but to him it said, this is it. This LSD thing is it. And he got a hold of it. He was very well connected. He'd run Switzerland for the OSS during the war, goes to Sandoz. He gets I don't know how much, I'll just say a shitload of LSD. It's variously been said to be 100,000 doses or a gallon vial. And he saw himself as this catalytic agent for change. He introduced, by his own count, 6,000 people to LSD. And in what was an avowed effort to change the course of human civilization. He believed, and here's a quote from a colleague of his, Abram Hoffer, if he could give the psychedelic experience to the major executives of the Fortune 500 companies, he would change the whole of society. Not just corporate executives, but also religious leaders. He gave it to people in the church, political leaders. He got it to people in Washington. He just basically had this idea that if he could get the society's elite to change their consciousness, this consciousness would filter down. Hubbard's idea was embraced by Huxley and shared by Huxley, who also believed you should turn on the best and brightest, not everybody, and that was the best way to do it. And that was a big part of the effort in the 50s. And that's, I mentioned last night how psychedelics came to Silicon Valley. It was Hubbard turning on a series of software people. I don't think they were called software people then. People at Ampex and other companies. And he would take them out to Death Valley and trip them there. And he actually helped invent the method that is now common of playing, beautiful music, eye shades, lying down, guide, owes to this guy, which is kind of, yet he's sort of been written out of the history. The other approach is best symbolized by Leary, of course. Leary's idea was, no, turn on everybody. And Allen Ginsberg, too, and Ken Kesey. They were populists in this. And Leary actually made a calculation of how many people you would have to trip before you could, as he said, blow the mind of America. It was 4 million. And he said this could happen by 1969. As it happened, by 1969, the best information we have is only 2 million people had tripped, but they had blown the mind of America. And one of the things you need to think about is have psychedelics already changed human consciousness? I know you're eager to change it more, but let's look, has it already changed human consciousness? And you could make a case that that's what the 60s was, that there was a change in human consciousness that happened in the 60s, and we saw it reflected in the anti-war movement, we saw it in the arts, we saw it in music, we saw it in social manners and mores, we saw it in language, and we saw it in the rise of feminism, when we saw it in the rise of the environmental movement, and all these things, although there are many factors involved, you could make a very good case that psychedelics were in the mix, were a key ingredient in the recipe for that new cake that was baked in the 60s.
Our podcast today is brought to you by BetterHelp. I've been doing therapy since my late 20s, and to me, therapy is everything. You know, it really is. It's helped me get through some of the roughest times in my life and live my life more truly. BetterHelp provides online therapy directly to you at a price that's more affordable than traditional offline therapy. So it's a great way to invest in yourself without breaking the bank, and just kind of experiment with talking to another individual whose only job in the world is to help you unravel yourself and take a look at your defenses. When you sign up, you'll match with a therapist according to your needs. And who knows, it might take a few tries to find the right fit for you, so BetterHelp makes it easy and free to change therapists if needed. They have a special offer for our listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Esalen. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/Esalen. When they ask you how you heard of BetterHelp, be sure to type in Voices of Esalen. Coming soon at Esalen, Microdosing, the safe, surprising, and emerging psychedelic frontier. This is January 13th to 15th, 2023, with Jim Fadiman and Adam Bramblage. Join legendary psychedelics researcher and the father of the modern microdosing movement, Jim Fadiman, PhD. He's a past guest on Voices of Esalen. I loved his episode. And microdosing educator and coach Adam Bramblage, just met him, super cool guy, in this groundbreaking workshop to learn all about the most current and best practices in the world of microdosing. What is microdosing? Using sub-hallucinogenic amounts of psychedelics to possibly improve your mental health, creativity, your athletic performance, possibly alleviate depression, migraines, chronic pain, addictions, and more. This weekend of discussions, participant reports, coaching methods, and research results will explore the history, science, and best practices for safe and effective microdosing. Learn more or register now at esalen.org/workshops.
The potential is there. This fight, though, over the best way to do it, the idea of turning on everyone was regarded by the researchers as a big threat, and the kind of reluctance to talk this way that you find today, I think, owes to this 60s experience and the backlash. Because as soon as you start talking to mainstream society about, hey, we want to change you, we want to change everything, you've entered the political realm. Obviously, that is what politics is. And you're going to get resistance. It's a very natural thing. There are people who don't want to change. There are people with strong investments in the status quo. So it's important to understand that taking that position on popularizing psychedelics is a political act, and it will probably engender some kind of political resistance. That's not a reason not to do it, but you're in a fight, and it's important to know that. This democratic approach is very threatening to the status quo, and that's certainly how it was perceived. So where does this leave us? Well, as I said the other day, it's not fluoride. We're not going to put it in the water. I think we have to look at these two approaches and see what makes most sense. I actually think, as much as I'll bet most of our instincts move toward the democratic approach, a lot of the work we're doing is not going down that line. I mean, when Rick Doblin is giving psychedelics to the peace activists in the Middle East, as he hopes to do, that's the elite approach, right? Give it to people who can have influence beyond their numbers. It's a leveraged strategy. There's a study now going on, I mentioned last night, at NYU and Hopkins to give psychedelics, psilocybin, to religious professionals These too are people whose influence is highly leveraged. If you could have a spiritual revival among the leaders of the major religions, that would influence their parishioners and have this knock-on effect. What about all the activists, the environmentalists, the climate activists doing this really hard work and getting very discouraged and having to knock their heads against the same wall for decades? This could benefit them. Again, you have a leveraged approach. I think giving it to scientists is a really interesting idea. People trying to work on philosophy of mind. People, to get scientists to question their materialist assumptions. That too could have a knock-on effect that could be quite powerful and revealing. I think that we should think about that. So don't dismiss the elite idea. We might need a better word for it, influencers, okay? Maybe it's a safer approach. Change makers, thank you. That's a very neutral term. I like that. But if you are going to take the democratic approach, it takes more than just saying everybody should use these drugs. It really takes reaching the populations who aren't getting them. If you really want to be democratic, we have to address this issue. Why are there so few people of color having access to psychedelics? Why is the movement so much more male than female? Why the poor don't have access to psychedelics? A real democratic approach to psychedelics would mean doing a lot more outreach to communities and figuring out how, either in a therapeutic context, religious context, or some other context, they could have access. Because, when we talk about democratic, we're talking about pretty white, pretty affluent people in general. And that was true in the 60s as well. Another way to think about the politics, and I'll leave you with this too, is we could think of psychedelics as a diagnostic tool for the politics we need to do. A lot of us are drawn to this idea because it sure seems neater and cleaner than getting out in the streets and organizing and doing real politics to be able to have a drug. It's a shortcut, right? As it is in many ways. I had lunch with Johan Hari, the writer, the journalist who writes on depression, and he's written a couple interesting pieces. Do you know him, Ben? Anyway, he's interesting to read on the subject of addiction and depression. And he did a piece on the depression study in Imperial College, and he interviewed this woman who had a really shitty low-level job in some company and was very depressed, and she was really one of these low people in the totem pole and was suffering stress or perhaps trauma as part of that. And she was in the depression trial, and she had a month of utter relief from her depression, which was a powerful experience. It hadn't happened in a long time. And her big insight is, we're all equal. We're all the same. But she went back to her job where she wasn't equal and she wasn't the same. And eventually her depression returned. What do we do with that? Well, equality is an issue here. So do we address her brain, or do we address the problem of inequality? And so I think we can use psychedelics when we think about the insights we have, the importance of love, the importance of connection, the sacredness of nature, that these are telling us what we need to work on in the straight world, in the sober world. And that they are giving us really good information that should inform our politics. So that's a third way to look at it. And, I don't have the answer, as I said. I think that it's a really rich and risky area to work in. But I think it's what brought a lot of us here. And what brings a lot of us to psychedelics, and that there is this takeaway that I want to share this, that this isn't just about me, that this could help lots of people or help a sick society. It's just not easy to go from that individual experience to that collective experience. So we have to think long and hard about it. So thank you. Thank you very much. I think that one of the big questions a lot of people come out of psychedelic experience with is, how do you apply this to a daily practice or a weekly practice? Because it isn't something you can do every day or every week. And of course, where many people come out is meditation. And there's this, Alan's written about this, there's this very interesting link between the coming of Buddhism to America and psychedelics, that most of the influential Buddhists, there's another model, by the way, of elite change. Most of the influential Buddhists started with psychedelics and were trying to figure out how to access that kind of consciousness in their daily lives. And meditation is a really good way to do it. And one of the things that, in my own experience, I found that, experience of psychedelics made me a much better meditator. Even though I know we're not supposed to be better or worse at it or strive or anything like that. And I was talking to, there's a researcher named Judd Brewer, who's a neuroscientist who studies meditation at Brown University. He, there was that famous finding that he was the guy who, when he looked at Robin Carhart Harris's fMRI scans of the brain and noticed the depression, activity in the default mode network, he was doing the same thing with long-term meditators, and he got the same. His scans looked very similar. And so this link was recognized, and he went down to, he hasn't written about this, but Judd went down to Hopkins and participated in one of their psilocybin tests. So he was giving a lot of thought to psychedelics and meditation. And he said to me in our interview that he could easily imagine a time when psychedelics are used as a kickstart for meditation practice. And that when you want to start meditating, you get it, you're tripped, and your integration works, on this question of how this might aid you as a meditator and give you a sense of the destination. And I think that makes really good sense. I think that there might be ways like that to use psychedelics as a tool to do more sustainable modes of consciousness change. I do. I mean, I can chart over the course of the last year a kind of mainstreaming of the issue, and the people who wouldn't consider this seriously are considering it now, and I think we will see all sorts of cultural products about it. 60 Minutes is doing a big piece on psilocybin research that they're coming to talk to me about, and I think they're going to Johns Hopkins. I'm not sure, and they're. I'm sure that there'll be films, and there are a lot of documentaries in the works. So I think many people are going to be learning about this who haven't learned about it. I mean, I don't know if people realize it. You're all book readers, presumably, but books reach a very small percentage of America. I mean, you could get a bestseller selling like 10,000 copies of a book in a week. I mean, if you sell them at that kind of pace. So, and this is 350 million people. So it's very important that it reach into other media, and it will. And I'm going to work on various projects to do that too. I don't know that Oprah's ready for it. I think that'll be a real interesting sign. She does this show now on cable called Super Soul Sunday, which I went on and talked about food a couple years ago, and it's about spirituality in everyday life. And I was amazed at the reach of that show, and how many African American women recognized me on the street, which had never happened before. I'm curious to see if she does this, and that'll tell us something. Yeah, and O did a big article on MDMA, but psilocybin. I want to see if she does something on psilocybin. So stay tuned, I'll let you know. In the same way that Stan Grof talked to them as unspecific amplifiers of mental processes, they're probably unspecific amplifiers of human tendencies and social tendencies and psychological tendencies. But they raise this possibility or fantasy in so many of the people who take it, at least in our culture. The one area where I thought that you could make the strongest case for the influence of psychedelics on culture was what we call the generation gap, where you had young people, rather than joining adult culture, attempting to create their own. Most rites of passage, and I think the acid trip is a rite of passage, most rites of passage are organized by the elders to bring the young into adult community. And so whether it's a vision quest or a bar mitzvah, it's designed by the adults, the young go through the hurdles, and then they join the adult. And it tends to knit societies together. That's what anthropologists will tell you rites of passage are all about.
You get a bunch of cash.
And you get a bunch of cash. Here was this really weird rite of passage that essentially was organized by the kids with some help from Timothy Leary's of the world. And they had what they regarded as much more powerful rite of passage than their bar mitzvah, if they were Jewish, or anything else. And they didn't end up in adult society. They ended up withdrawing from adult society. And like, we need our own lingo. We need our own sexual mores. We need our own food. We need our own, all these things. And that was very disruptive. And I think that you can lay at the feet of psychedelics. You don't want ego dissolution when you're going to the supermarket or teaching a class or speaking in front of a group like this. You need your ego. Ego is very useful. Ego got the book written. So I respect my ego. And that was actually, so to give you a little bit of narrative, for me, the most profound trip I had was this guided psilocybin trip where I felt safe enough and had enough psilocybin in me to undergo and support. Yeah, safe. Well, safety. I think that's key. That I felt that I had this experience of ego dissolution, and it was not frightening at all. And as I said, this other perspective that experienced it opened up. That this was a new guy. I didn't know who this was. I don't even know if it was a guy. Where I could observe it without being frightened or troubled in any way. And it led to this sense of merging. And in this case, it was about a piece of music. This Bach unaccompanied cello suite, number 2 in D minor, which I put it on your phone. It's an amazing piece. It's the saddest piece of music you've ever heard. And you've heard it at funerals, actually. And at least I had. The subject-object duality disappeared, and I became this piece of music in a way that's very hard to describe. Because our language, how we use narrative, always depends on subjects and objects. And so here I was in this place where I was this music. I felt the bow, Yo-Yo Ma's bow, as if it were going over my skin, and I was inside the hollow of the cello, and it was extraordinary. It wasn't ecstatic, except in the literal sense, as I wasn't in my body, I was somewhere else. But it was sad. It was, profoundly sad. It was all about reconciling oneself to death. And I went back for my integration, and I didn't really know what to do with it. My guide, who I call Mary in the book, she said, I told the story, and I said I had this experience of my ego turning into this little cloud of Post-it notes and then this coat of paint on the landscape. And I said, I learned that there's another ground on which to stand, that when your ego's gone, you don't die, you don't disappear. There's somewhere else, there's another floor. And that was kind of amazing. And she said to me, well, isn't that worth the price of admission? And I said, yeah, but it's over now. My ego is back in uniform, on patrol. So what good was that, right? What good was that? And she said something interesting and kind of obvious. She said, well, you've had a taste of another way to be. You've learned something about your ego. You can practice that way of being. And you can get back to that. And I said, how? And she said, meditation, actually. That's a way to kind of keep that or restore that kind of perspective. So, I think the challenge is getting a little distance on your ego. It's not destroying it. It's realizing it. It's one of perhaps several characters in your mind. You don't always have to obey what it says. Now, of course, this is what happens in conventional psychotherapy, right? You can do 10 years getting a little perspective on your ego. But here it happened in an afternoon. And so that was kind of powerful. So I think it's about shrinking the ego, not destroying the ego. Well, speaking as a journalist and someone who's observed politics for a long time, don't trust the good press. It could change like that. It changed in 1965 almost overnight, right? Before 1965, the media loved LSD, loved psilocybin. I was surprised to learn when I was researching the book that Time Life, Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce were huge supporters of psychedelics. They both had psychedelic therapy in L.A. Sidney Cohen had given them LSD therapy. And they ran one positive article after another about psychedelics from 57, when they published Gordon Wasson's account of his rediscovery of psilocybin, to just a whole suite of articles. And Look magazine, too, we saw from Jim's talk, was very, very supportive. And then, but the press is not, the press is licensed by politicians, some fundamental level, the mainstream press. And if they turn against this, the press will turn against this. Or the press might on its own, just because they get tired of positive stories. And what else is there to write about psilocybin? Well, somebody died in the depression trial. Suddenly that becomes a really big story. God, there's risks here we didn't know about. And that plugs into a pre-existing narrative that psychedelics are scary, even though, as Rick said, probably someone will die in one of these trials. And it's not unusual. And people die from SSRIs all the time, or when they're on them. That doesn't plug into a pre-existing narrative quite as powerfully as this does. So the possibility of backlash, I think everybody should be aware of. And I think we should talk openly about risks, because that will inoculate things when something bad happens. It's not like we were blindsided. We knew this was a risk, but we're weighing it against these great benefits. I think that we should be wary of any gurus that emerge. That complex is never a happy thing in the long term. So look, this is a real paradox of psychedelic experience. This ego-dissolving experience has produced some of the great egomaniacs of all time. I don't know. Maybe the psychiatrist can help us with this one. But I've observed this over and over again. And some of it, I think, has to do with this sense that you've had such a profound experience. It's like you've gone to the mountain, you've gotten the tablets from God, and then you're a guru. So that you've acquired this key that's so powerful, and you want to tell everybody about it, but you have it. And I don't know. There are ways in which psychedelics reinforce our bad tendencies too, and I think we need to be alert to it. I spent a lot of time figuring out, how can you describe a psychedelic experience to someone who's never had one? Most trip reports are written for other trippers, right? And that's easy, People know what you're talking about, There was a moment I was describing about, I was speaking in England to a psychedelic society, and I was telling the story of this, what happened earlier on this trip that I just described, it with the ego dissolution and going into the bathroom. I just needed a break. It was getting so intense. And I go into the bathroom. I'm really careful not to look in the mirror. And somebody says, yes, trip face. I didn't know about trip face. But there's a community that does. And I didn't want to write for the people who know about trip face. And it was hard to do. It was the hardest thing I've done as a writer were those scenes. And I spent a lot of time figuring out how to do it. And if you read those scenes, you'll see I'm not in the experience the whole time. I go back and forth between being in the experience and describing what's happening and stepping out and essentially breaking the fourth wall and saying to the reader, I know how crazy this sounds, or yes, I know, love, it's a platitude, but it's also, so I'm constantly aware of my skeptical reader. And I think we all need to do that when we're talking to civilians. There is a sense in which these amplify feelings or wishes that people have. There's also this really interesting sense that James called the noetic quality of psychedelic experience, that the insights you have a weight and sturdiness that they don't have in normal life. And this is a strange phenomenon, but the smokers, I interviewed a lot of the people who'd gone through the smoking cessation study, and they had the weirdest, I would say, like, why were you able to stop smoking after a single psychedelic trip? It seems so implausible. And I remember this one woman telling me, she was this Irish woman, about 60, And she said, well, I had the most amazing trip. I sprouted wings and I flew through European history and I witnessed all these incredible scenes and I met Shakespeare and Galileo and I died 3 times and I saw my smoke rise from the Ganges and I realized, there's so much to do and see in the world that killing yourself with cigarettes is really stupid. And this incredibly banal insight was like written on a tablet, and she could live by it, and she's still not smoking. And so that, whatever we explain it as, is a powerful tool in therapy. If you can make people so sure of an obvious insight like that I'm sure she's heard 1 million times, you can work with that, it seems to me. So I think we have to be very aware of that. I do think that a lot of the insights I had were not new, but I felt them in a way I had previously only understood them. I tell a lineage of the psychedelic renaissance in my book. It's not the only one. And there was other research going on. There was the DMT research going on in New Mexico. So there were some other things going on. I chose, though, as you often do when you're constructing a history, in focusing on one particular lineage. And I decided that those events, beginning with Bob's work getting Hopkins launched, at least on the psilocybin side of things, not the MDMA side of things, was really the important lineage that launched things. And particularly this paper in 2006 about mystical experience. If you haven't read it, it's a kind of wild piece of science that such a piece of science would actually come out of Johns Hopkins. It had no pretense to any therapeutic purpose, any practical purpose at all, but it was whether could you use psilocybin to occasion, that was the verb they used, a mystical experience, fairly high dose, I think like 25 milligrams. And they found that in about 2/3 of cases you could. And this was what they called a mystical type experience, that it met all the criteria on the Hood mysticism scale. And that now that science could reliably do this, you could begin to explore, well, what would be the use of such an experience? Would it be transformative, as it seemed to be for these people? But something I don't think we've laid enough emphasis on in terms of the Renaissance, although Ben alluded to it this morning, is that there's a desperation in mental health care in this country, and a lack of tools and very little innovation since the late 80s, early 90s with the SSRIs. And that, I think, is driving this. I had a very interesting experience that speaks to that, and also the resistance, which is still out there, and I think we should talk about a little bit more, because although you might not find it everywhere, I speak all over the country, and there still is... drugs are scary to a lot of people still, and I think we need to address that better than we do. Anyway, when the first thing I wrote about this was a piece in the New Yorker called "The Trip Treatment." That was my introduction to the subject, and it was about the work with the dying that was going on at NYU and Hopkins. And I handed in this piece, and to my surprise, the New Yorker accepted it, and all was going along swimmingly. And then 4 or 5 days before the piece closed, the last time you can do anything to it, I get a call from my editor, and his editor, the editor-in-chief of the New Yorker, had gotten cold feet about the piece. And he thought it was way too positive, and he wanted me to call and find some big shots who thought it was all bullshit. So I had a day of frantic dialing, and I thought, well, who's a big shot likely to think this is all bullshit? And I figured, the head of the National Institute of Mental Health. That should be a good person. So Tom Insel was the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, and I tracked him down. He was in Davos. I get him on the phone, and I tell him about this, and instead of saying, well, I don't think we should be looking at these drugs, they're drugs of abuse, he said, no, I think this research is really interesting. And what you need to understand, and he didn't tell me this until he had given up the job, but we had an interview subsequently. He said, what you don't understand is how broken mental health care is in this country. and that we need to be open. We need to consider possibilities that might seem outside of the box or frightening to some people. And indeed, he's since gotten involved with psychedelic medicine. I still had to find my this is all bullshit person.
Did you?
Yeah, Nora Volkow at the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Yeah. She obliged with a completely meaningless comment about how these drugs can be abused. And that satisfied my editor and the I've been sort of a one-man focus group on this. I'm traveling all over the country talking to, this is unusual that I talk to an audience that knows this much about psychedelics. And to just be very matter-of-fact about, yes, I had these experiences, I wanted to see what it was like, and here's what happened. And I just find if you're matter-of-fact about something, people respond in kind. And if you act as if it's a shameful thing or it's a adventurous thing, you know, they'll tense up. But I do think we have to talk about risk. We have to talk about the fact that I find when I speak to a group that there are always some people, and they're usually women with children still at home, who tense up at the whole discussion of psychedelics as medicine. And I can feel the resistance from them. I can see it in the body language. And if I don't talk about risk, they'll wait till the question period and they'll say they've heard some horror story. And it might be true story. It's not necessarily, scrambling chromosomes or something like that. There's a lot of urban legends that people have heard, and they remember. The stickiness, the propaganda is incredible. And if you don't talk about risk, nobody hears you until it comes up. They just close their ears. So I've learned to talk about it early on, and I talk about the physiological risks, and which are quite mild, and the lack of addictive potential, which is shocking to people. And I say there are psychological risks that people have had psychotic breaks, or people have panic attacks that sometimes puts them in the emergency room, rightly or wrongly, and that things do go wrong. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, and then we can talk about risks versus benefits.
Today's episode was produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our music is by Nico Holloman.
Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions.
If you're enjoying the show, please support us by sharing on social media or by going to your favorite podcast player and leaving a review. It really does help. Until next time, be well.